Hi, Bill.
Hi, Sandy. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm a bit
We
concerned.
have just one day left until New Year's.
Yeah, so we should do an early cheers to New Year and to
All
anybody
right,
who ever watches us. Cheers.
there we go. Clink.
Coca-Cola. I have pink lemonade.
Quality.
You know, because you and I
Do
are
you, do you
such.
make your own? Do you make your own pink lemonade?
No.
What makes pink lemonade pink as opposed to regular lemonade, which is lemon colored?
No idea. It just looks nice.
Yeah, tastes different too.
Anyway, speaking of seeing tonight is called Emergence, not emergency, Emergence. And the word I think is significant in as much as I can ever know what is going to be said or the reason why I may have picked the paintings I have. And also just to mention the paintings this evening, there are 3 of them. It's a kind of continuity or continuation of what we were speaking about last week in our Christmas special. But I want to know what you think of the word emergence.
Emergence. Do you think that there is a? I think of emergence as something that has. There have been inputs into a new creative cauldron, and out of that emerges something new.
Yeah. I think there's because probably of the word emergency as well, there is in an emergence, the process of revealing, being revealed, somehow coming into consciousness almost, but with a sense of urgency maybe.
Do you think emergence is more related to ideas than physical stuff?
It can be. In fact, when I was looking at the meaning of the word, I wrote it down. It said the act or process of emerging as a development of idea. So
it's
of a development, something comes into being, and the fact that something comes into being implies to me that there may be a crossover somehow with creativity.
Okay.
Anyway,
it's interesting that can I just say one thing about that though is interesting is I think that we as people who think a lot about art and involved in art, I think we tend to think of creativity as the beginning of the story. Like there is this idea that comes out of quote unquote nothing, but the reality is that it kind of probably comes out of some sort of soup of whatever experiences and ideas are floating around in one's head at one time, and your brain shakes it all up and pours it out.
I think that's a very modern way of thinking about creativity. And
sure, but I think it's probably more accurate than the original ways of thinking about it, psychologically at least.
I mean, my art teacher at school, when I was a teenager, Mr. Gilchrist, used to say to me, Sandy, art cannot exist and indeed does not exist in a vacuum. And he would say it over and over to me. And I now sometimes find myself saying it to students as a means of illustrating that the art they make for their exams, for example, has to show evidence of linking to someone else's work.
Right.
However, I would say that more broadly, does art always come from somewhere it's been before? Or, are we only ever the sum total of our memory? And
I think we are the sum total of our memory plus one.
Well,
and that's the creativity. Well, that's the new thing that somebody adds. That's the actual creativity. I think that in the end, you're only adding 1 or 2% to anything that comes out of you.
What about
I think most things have come before. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. Say again?
What about the divine?
Well, I think that the divine is a good myth.
Anybody watching, Bill and I have just spoken, or really rather argued for about 20 minutes about
yes.
the very thing, actually, before we started.
We did, yes.
I've
I
never
just,
met
you know,
anybody.
I want to see John. I wish somebody could go back in a time machine and take a picture of John the Baptist or Jesus or any of these people. I want to see what they actually looked like. You know, assuming they existed. I would love to see. They're probably just, he's probably some grizzled old guy, and like they make him out to be, yeah, the hair and the whole thing. How our image of these people changes depending on the time period of which we imagine them. You know, it's kind of amazing. Go ahead. Sorry.
You're so funny, Bill. I would also just like to tell our watchers that before we started, you did in actual fact say that you're very conscious of how much you talk over me. And lo and behold, within the first 4 minutes of speaking, you have actually talked over me.
Go ahead. Say what. Introduce. I was trying to get it in before you introduced the big topic, because then I wouldn't be able to get that out. Go ahead.
Well, emergence for me with this is about the depth of darkness from which something comes forth into being or into understanding or awareness. And this painting has a very particular resonance of magic for me. And again, I'm going to use the word heretical. I understand that me talking about magic or fable to some might seem sacrilegious, because this figure is so important as a religious character, a religious figure in Christianity, although he does appear in other religious texts as well. But this particular image of John the Baptist is one of real mystery. It was the final painting that Leonardo made in his life. I don't know if that gives it a special quality as well. I mean, it was the apogee of the kind of this style that had been refined over many years. There are many similarities. Looking at this painting, we could pick out qualities of Leonardo in the work. The enigmatic smile, for example, is very, very similar to Mona Lisa.
Sure.
There's a lot in this painting that identifies it as a Leonardo painting. The sfumato, which is the painting technique that's kind of the lifeblood really of what made high Renaissance painting so spectacular, and for its time very modern, where you've got that very careful transition blending between color, for example, and tone. So I mean, sfumato it just translates into English as blurry, smoky, as if someone's done a kind of almost like a soft focus across all the different hues. And sometimes in these kinds of paintings, and later we'll see another artist working in a relatively similar way, we could almost say they're monochromatic. I mean, they're not, but the register for us is so much about light and dark. But because of that sfumato technique, if we look very closely and very carefully at the application of the paint, the smoothness, and again, this idea of the smoothness of the transition between colors and tone, it's so creamy is the way I would describe it.
Yeah, you could almost see a black and white version of this and just tint it different colors, and you could get to pretty close to this. You know, there's a color in here, but it's all kind of the same color, except maybe the hair. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to see it in this version. I think this is probably the most faithful version that I could find as a digital reproduction. This version I took from the Wikipedia page about this painting. But when you see it as other digital copies, things like the reed cross that's in his left hand comes out a bit more. You can really see that there, and you can see the quality of the painting of the fur, that textural sense as well. I'm not sure, sometimes in very careful restoration of painting, they might bring forth the more kind of textural qualities of the paint, but truthfully, the faithful sense of this would be that it would be very dark. And that's the thing in terms of emergence, that's the obvious part. which is that John emerges into our consciousness. He emerges into our space. So the eye of the beholder, we're in very close proximity to him, or at least that's the way I feel, and I suspect that's the way that Leonardo intended the viewer to feel, that John occupies a very intimate space with us, to guide us, to show us. There's also lots written about this painting that is to do with the kind of erotic charge in it, the androgyny of it, the quality, again, this creaminess of the skin, that one wants to go into it to be with this person, and yet this person straddles this idea of the human and the divine somehow. And we often find this in paintings of Christ, actually, that we would look upon a body that is profoundly beautiful conceptually and then intellectually, yet also physically. And with this depiction of John, there's a warmth and an intimacy to it that is quite breathtaking and also quite unsettling.
Well, there's also like a soft sort of puffiness. There's not a lot of muscle tone or any of the kind of things that if it was a relatively younger man of those times, probably be, you know, it's that also leads to the androgynal kind of concept, right?
Well, the hair is long and dark and curly.
Yeah. Do you find that his head is just slightly out of proportion to the body?
I don't know if it's the head. I suspect it's the position of the head with the neck.
Okay.
If you look at it very carefully, it's the distance.
Yeah.
You know, the head probably shouldn't be quite there.
Yeah.
But I think that, again, for Leonardo, who was such a master of really everything as a polymath, he would understand about proportion, and he would probably have done that quite deliberately. There would be nothing thoughtless in this. It would all be intentional. I think also what I want to say about it is that sometimes you find this in horror films, where something comes out of the darkness very slowly, you become aware of it. It doesn't shock you as a kind of sudden thing, but that there's an emergence of something that's truly terrifying. And in one way, this is the Renaissance painted version of that, because actually he is unsettling. He is unsettling. And you can imagine him disappearing back into those shadow spaces.
Almost like it's a cave or a dark doorway or something, you know. You don't know what's back there.
The fact that he's pointing up, obviously, the ascension to heaven. He is the person who baptized Christ. He is the man whose head ended up on a platter.
Yep.
Because Salome pleased the king.
Yeah, go back 6 episodes of this show.
Yep. There's a lot speculated about Leonardo in his personal life. So for someone who's so well documented, I mean, his notebooks are pored over, his paintings are really well known, his drawings, cartoons are famous. He's probably the most iconic artist of ever, I would say. We know that, you know, anybody doing a poll would say that the Mona Lisa is the most famous painting in the world. Why that is not relevant, actually, just the fact is that things like the Vitruvian Man is a kind of iconic, has its own iconic status. And The Last Supper, painted by Leonardo, is the most reproduced painting in the world. So we've got a big hitter in terms of art history.
Have you been in there to see that, the Last Supper?
Yeah.
Because last time I was in that area, it was right after it had finished being restored, and it was like a 6-month waiting period to go see it. So I didn't get to go in, but
yeah, and also they've done so much conservation work with it.
Yeah.
lots of people will know this, that, sometimes I'm aware in galleries that things are controlled so that the light doesn't impact the image.
Yeah.
But with that particular painting, it's degraded quite rapidly, I think. I can't remember.
Yeah. He didn't do a great job with the
Yeah, so I mean,
plaster work.
most of the other painted images that we see of Leonardo or of Leonardo's work don't require the same level of care and restoration.
Yeah, they're on panels and things. Yeah.
That's also maybe why I suppose you could say that's why it's reproduced so much, because there's a fear that it will be lost.
Sure. He used an experimental fresco process, as I recall.
Something, and
but I might be
hasn't.
Yeah, it's been flaking off. But yeah, go ahead.
This painting is magical. So it hangs in the Louvre in Paris. It has its own nature. Now, there just sometimes are paintings that as individuals we may respond to very deeply. There's a profound sense. I have a profound sense of something in this painting that I find very difficult to pin down and to articulate. And those paintings tend to be the ones that I love the most.
Wait, that you react to it in a certain way that you don't quite understand?
That there's something other that happens. And that in that emerging of this character, it no longer is a character at all. It's something else, a space between this image and I doesn't have almost seem like a spatial reality, doesn't have anything of normal, easy to package, parcel in and speak about quality. It simply has a profound effect. And I tend to want to stay with this, but I also want to move away from it. And there's an element of fear about it, as much as there is an abiding sense of something that is sublime.
Do you think that can we just take a quick tangent for a second? Because I find that interesting. I have seen this painting in reproductions. I've been to the Louvre. I've seen this painting. I did not have the same reaction to this painting. But the paintings that I am most attracted to are ones where, when I am in their presence, I am satisfied in the sense that they click for me and they make me feel like I'm at the bottom of a gravity well, like they couldn't be any other way. And that I find that sort of, I'm not OCD, but I can imagine that it's what somebody who has OCD kind of feels is satisfying. You're saying that the paintings that you find most interesting to you, the ones you love the most, tend to be enigmatic ones that make you feel multiple things at once, and some of it might actually be repulsion as opposed along with attraction. And that it's I'm just wondering, I'm just trying to get an idea, is that true? Do you understand what I'm trying to get at? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Interesting.
This painting is unusual though in that way for me, because often I find that with abstract painting. You know, I've talked before to you and probably on here at some point about being in the Rothko room at Tate Modern.
Sure.
Being absorbed into the surface of the image, which is not an image. Whereas it is an image. This carries with it the loaded language of all representation, of all the codes, codifications, signals, symbols, of human form, of the language of religion and religiosity.
Right. The reason why we know who he is, except for the
because of the things that I've been interested in my life, you know, I am not a religious person, as you know, I might say it many times, but I know a lot about religion actually because of painting.
Sure.
Because of painting.
I think anybody who studied Western art has a certain knowledge about at least Christianity due to that. Yes, but yeah.
But this is almost like meeting. I was going to use a religious thing there as well. I was going to. This is like meeting the magi or the magi. It's about encountering something that emerges to be with me, or for me to be with it, whatever it is.
Do you think if Da Vinci had used a model and you were in the space with the person who's modeling for this, and he was in a little shaft of light or something like that, and you were standing 3 feet away, you would feel the same way? Or is it his representation of that person?
No idea, Bill.
Okay.
I mean, I do want to go back to this idea of like an erotic charge. You know, that's been written about by several art historians. And there is a sense of that for me. And it's not that I find this figure particularly attractive to me, for example, sexually attractive. There's just something so sensual about it. I mean, as I was kind of leading to, you know, Leonardo's personal life, it's very mysterious. For someone who was such an important public figure, even in his lifetime, he, apart from when he was a younger man, he was arrested for sodomy. I think a very well-known, I think, Florentine male prostitute was caught with 3 young men, one of them being Leonardo. Eventually, the charges were dropped because one of the other young men happened to be a relation of one of the Medici.
Of course.
And so the charges were thrown out. But I mean, apart from that thing that's recorded as a court record, there's actually no other mention. He did have I think a female companion for a while, but whether she was a lover, nobody knows. There's so much known about Leonardo's output in so many other aspects of his life and obviously his work, but his personal life, you know, people speculate all the time about his sexuality. The reason why I mention it with this is that I do wonder if that sense of magic is because actually maybe this was a lover, and there's a deep, well, is it tenderness? There's something is communicated, something emerges. And so not only does this figure emerge from the black background, but there's also a sense that emerges towards the viewer, me, from it. And through the kind of ideology of the painting, the concept of the painting, we have John the Baptist and his emergence into almost like a public consciousness of what it means to be Christian, of what it means to be worshipful, of being devoted. So many layers to this painting.
It's interesting when I look at religious paintings, especially of, say, Christian saints and symbols and, you know, all the rest of it, how much of who it is comes down to what they're holding in their hands and which way their arms are pointed, right? You know what I mean? Because that's we have this like coded mythology of visual cues of, oh, that's this person because they're holding a red scarf, and in the Bible they say they were holding a red scarf, whatever. But otherwise, you would have no idea who it was. If he was just standing there, not holding a cross, not pointing up, not doing whatever it is, people would have wearing what he's wearing. No one would have any idea. It would be just some guy, right? The old thing. So it's interesting to me how we use those cues and then imbue what, you know, at the turn of this century that he painted this at was probably some local model, and we imagine him as somebody who actually lived 1,500 years before.
Yeah.
You know, it's so interesting to me the way that works in art history, especially religious art, which, you know, of course, is the last 1,800 years.
You are talking about the, you know, the semiological values of this painting.
Yeah.
It's not especially obvious. I've said about the cross. There's a reed cross.
Yeah.
There are lots of things that are affiliated and associated as the symbols of John.
Yep.
He was a red martyr, for example. So this painting, although I said earlier it could almost be monochromatic, the fact is that there's a heavy emphasis on red. In really, we translate it as brown in the darkness of
Right.
it, in the warmth. So he was a red martyr. I don't know if you know what that means, but there's different levels of martyrdom as written about by particular factions within the Christian church. A red martyr is someone who has shed blood for their religion, right? So obviously, in John the Baptist's case, he didn't die necessarily for Christ, but I mean, he was interred in prison, which is where he was pulled out from in the bowels of the palace or wherever it was, at Salome's behest. So he's a red martyr. He's like the highest level of martyr for Christian culture. I mean, other levels of martyrdom also, the colors represent different things. So there's red, there's blue, sometimes it's called green, but it's red, blue, and white. But also there's wet martyrs and dry martyrs.
I mean, isn't it interesting though that we do the same thing now for, I don't know, military deaths, right? In America, there are the Gold Star families. These are, people whose families lost a son or daughter or some, a child who died in war, and we give them hierarchies of different awards and that kind of stuff. It's just interesting how the West is so hierarchical that way that, I guess it comes out of the Catholic Church and all of it, but it's fascinating.
Well, we're positional in everything we do. I mean, religion, just human nature is positional.
Sure.
I said at the start, this is kind of like a sequel. We talked about Caravaggio last time. This is rather an extraordinary ensemble.
Jesus was in good shape in this one at his death. Look at that.
Well, he does have the body of a laborer, is how it's described. And again, this idea of there being something profoundly erotic in the Pietà. Often people cite that as that it's a deeply sensual moment. Is Christ being taken down from the cross, prepared for burial? Again, Caravaggio, we've talked about him many times now. The emergence, again, the idea that we come forward into a space through darkness, that there's something perhaps of enlightenment in the luminosity of what we can actually register and what we do actually see. But we have this most beautiful composition. And again, if we think back to what we talked about last time, this idea of there being a diagonal, strong diagonal, always in Caravaggio's most successful paintings. This is no exception. We've got an ensemble cast of 6 people with the body of Christ, sculptural really, in its quality of the nostalgia. We've got Mary Magdalene, we've got Mother Mary, we've got Mary of Clopas, we've got Christ, obviously, John the Evangelist, not John the Baptist, John the Evangelist, as in the Gospel of John, and Nicodemus, who brings the herbs and anointments essential for burial. I mean, in one way, it's actually quite ghastly, again, this idea of gruesomeness. Caravaggio famed for realism, moving away from the manneristic style of before. We've got someone actually reaching their hand into his wound, to grasp him.
I noticed that. I always found the woman in the back with her hands up, something about the light on her was always very successful in this painting to me.
That's Mary Clopas.
Yeah, I mean, it's just perfect.
That's Mother Mary's sister, I think.
Yeah, that's good stuff right there.
It is. It's so dramatic, even without her arms.
Yeah. Although her arms add to it, it's just like, listen, just in compositionally, it's funny how, it's interesting how, a theater director could construct a similar stack of people. It would be equally successful today as it was in a painting from 400 and something years ago. It's kind of interesting to me.
What emerges for you, though, Bill, when we look at this painting?
It's interesting because you keep talking about the dark backgrounds, and I keep thinking that, yes, all of the things you say could be true. I also wonder how much of it just had to do with the fact that Caravaggio thought, I'm not going to waste any time on backgrounds that don't really matter to the story anyway. And why give the viewer any visual cues that are going to take them away from what's really important?
Well,
might as well make this
stylistic choice, right? But
right.
Talking about things that emerge, that are an emotional connection,
right?
Might emerge. So the kind of almost the acquisition of these paintings into our own sense of awareness and understanding.
Yeah, but I guess what I mean is to say is that I find that it is that level of contrast that there's something about the way, well, this is true of any Caravaggio, there's something about the way that the best Caravaggio paintings they pop, and it feels like they couldn't be any other way. Does that make sense? Like they feel like they emerge complete to me.
This is a very colorful painting.
Yeah. Well, yeah. More so than the last, certainly. Look at the green and the orange and the blue of the cloak in the back, and
But there's a very clever balance of color.
Of course, yeah.
In this.
That's the genius of people like this, right? Where there is all this color in there, and if you're looking at these paintings from a straight question of color theory and stuff, they work, the best of them. But you shouldn't really notice any of those things for it to be really successful.
What should you notice, Bill?
I used to talk about in photos, it's like if you can see the lights, then you kind of failed. The lighting should be invisible as much as it does impact everything. In this case, I think that you should notice these people's faces. And of course, the way, even on the shadowed side of his face, I'm looking at the right leg of the man in front, right? Like how you can still see the light coming through the cloth is muted and darkened, right? But you can still have enough light to really see detail in his leg. Like I look at that and just think, oh, God, this guy was good. So
can I say something or ask
sure,
something or pose something about this?
Yeah, pose a question.
You and I differ, and we are.
What are you saying?
Seismically different in terms of how much of a tolerance we may or may not have to things that could or could not be about the magical or the spiritual. Caravaggio, as we know, was a pretty beastly man.
Yeah, scoundrel, I think would be a good word, but yes.
Is there an emergence of something other in his paintings than him? To paint this way, again, last week we talked about this enormous tenderness, this love. Where does that come from in a man? Or maybe he's just a fool. There's a fullness to his character that we're unaccustomed to in our rather two-dimensional world. Or one.
Yeah. I generally think of Caravaggio the way, Schaeffer painted Mozart and Amadeus, where it's just like, this is the guy that God gives this capability to. This is the person who has all of this ruffian, this disgusting, childish imp. This is the person who creates the sound of the music, like the music of God. I think of Caravaggio the same way, and I'd imagine that the people around him were just like, damn it, why is that the guy who can paint like that? The guy who is in no way living the life that Christ was describing.
But nonetheless, though he would have been commissioned, we know he was commissioned.
I think he was just a really good probably sociopathic mimic and could do this. I don't think he believed in it at all.
I'm not even talking about his conscious belief. I'm talking about something else that channels through or patches through from somewhere else to enable this. To enable this. It's not because it's not even necessarily about the quality of the painting. And I find it with this one as well, there's like, so what if Leonardo da Vinci was having an affair with this model?
Sure.
So what if it's John the Baptist? So what actually if it's Leonardo da Vinci painting?
Sure.
The fact is that in the painting itself, for me, there's a presence that goes beyond the ordinary, past that which is actually of anything that we might think of as particularly earthbound, and something else starts to come out. Something comes through it.
See, I would say that what you describe as magic is just what emerges from extreme excellence. That some things just peak out above some threshold, and we look at them and we think, I don't understand how somebody could have made a piece of music that was that beautiful without some divine intervention. It's just like, well, that person got really lucky and had a really good idea and worked at it and polished it until it was this thing that to you looks divine, as it were. But in reality, is just an extreme example of, humanity. I know you don't like that answer.
I don't think of it as an answer.
What is it? Why does it have to be something else?
It doesn't have to be anything. That's why.
Yeah. Okay, but why do you believe that some things are, that painting has something in it that is at a level that I can't explain it other than putting some magic or woo in it to explain it?
Maybe the kind of paradigm of excellence that you speak of has just got a different language to it for me. In actual fact, we're talking about the same thing, but we're just applying different linguistics to it almost,
Yeah. But I do not see anything. I do not imply anything third party involved. You know what I mean?
I've chosen a very narrow slice of Western art history.
Yes. All these things take place in a 30-year period or 50 or 80-year period or whatever it is, right?
Slightly longer.
Oh, how far back did we go?
15,
when was Da Vinci?
1516.
Okay, so 130 years.
Right, but it's still a very narrow slice across the whole of a 17,000 year documented art history. But it does.
Wait, can I ask you one? Can I ask you one question? Do you think that there's a peak of art history? Is there a point at which you think that, not to say that great things can't be made after that, but do you think that that there was a zenith to what we imagine as Western art?
What a bizarre thing to ask. Time hasn't finished yet.
Time will never finish.
Exactly. So what's the point of your question?
I don't know. I feel like there have to be, statistical modes that pop up, like certain time periods that were magical, that where like society and artists were hitting on all cylinders, where new techniques came out. I think around 1600 was really interesting.
I think there's an element of a kind of self-congratulatory Western triumph in that, though.
Sure.
Not because I'm the most politically correct person in the world that I say that. I mean, I can really see that, for someone like me who's grown up in a Western art history tradition, I've invested my time knowing more about Western art history because that's been what one has been available to me when I was naive, ignorant, and very young. And then later, because actually there was something that I found compelling about particularly the Renaissance, for example. I don't find questions like that.
Well, hold on a second. If that is the case, if you're going to analyze it that way, then how can you make any distinction that you like any piece of work over any other piece of work? Because all of those same things you said apply individually as opposed on top of, globally across.
I would have to qualify, of course, my answer with saying I think. But I think to broadly suggest that there is a point of art history or a point in Western art historical culture.
Well, I'm not saying that whatever that point is in Western art is better than any other art in the world. I'm just saying whether Western art hit some sort of peak within itself.
But every age has its own
quality,
doesn't it? Every age, we might say, again, it's like the pat on the back, like, oh, isn't it fascinating to live through the end of the 20th century? Well, wouldn't it have been interesting to live through the start of the 20th century? Or
sure,
there'll be things at every age and stage. I think that there's a mainstream understanding of Renaissance and Baroque art culture that is more pronounced for more people than probably any other age and stage. And that's because of the iconic status of work by Leonardo,
sure,
Michelangelo. And it ties in with layer upon layer of, dare I say it, white Western privilege.
Sure, and Christian centrality and all the rest of it.
Well, I mean, think about the leverage gained or given to something that was already its own juggernaut by the wealthiest class being able to go on a grand tour.
Sure.
Right. And all of the moneyed classes finding themselves in Italy and visiting the frescoes, and that culture compounds culture in that case, because then not only were people seeing paintings and frescoes and thinking about them, but they were coming back and they were writing about it, and they were creating its own kind of additional layer of consciousness for mainstream.
And they were reading Vasari, and they were, going back and making art that was referencing the art back then, which gave it even more status. And yeah, absolutely.
Indeed. So again, to come back to your question, I can't answer it. I don't know the answer. I wouldn't I wouldn't perhaps even want to approach the question.
Interesting. I'm not saying that everything in the world has to be some hierarchy where things are better or worse than any others.
You kind of are.
But well, no. But I also think that it's also not nuts, but just sort of disingenuous to assume that there isn't some scale of quality that we rate things on, and certain things are going to be higher up than other things, and certain things are going to,
Well, I can say from my own point of view that this painting, for example, is utterly, devastatingly beautiful and very modern. And, for anyone who thinks about 20th century symbolism, realism, overlap, is going to find elements of that in this 17th century painting.
Mm-hmm.
And it has so much in it that hasn't just been cherry picked from the annals of time that came before it, but that, funnily enough, this work was completely lost. It was unknown in Georges de la Tour's lifetime. I mean, he was quite well known. And then after he died, he and his whole family died in 1652 from an epidemic, I think plague or something. All of them died, his whole family, all his siblings, I don't know if his parents were still alive actually, but all his children, everyone, they all died. And his work just disappeared. Nobody knew about it. And it wasn't until 1915, and it was an art historian, a German art historian, who was researching Vermeer, whose work had also been lost for hundreds of years. Really,
right.
It wasn't in this at all. Hermann Voss, not a pleasant man, but I'll come back to that in a minute. Anyway, he discovered this work, and some of the work he got muddled. He thought it was Vermeer's work, which it wasn't. And he kind of rediscovered Georges de la Tour in 1915. So from 1915 onwards, we have a better understanding of this artist's work. But this artist, who was influenced by Caravaggio, was nonetheless, I think, possibly the most masterful at painting by candlelight. So it's a specialism of his when we look across his relatively small output. There's this,
which would be really hard because there's not a lot of light that comes off a candle.
Well, I mean, if anyone is interested in this and likes the look of this painting, I would really recommend going and looking at the night paintings by Georges de la Tour and looking at how he paints candlelight, because it is just so beautiful, exquisite, in fact. Anyway, I mean, Hermann Voss, the reason why I say he's not a particularly nice character to talk about, he and Hitler got on famously, and he was tasked with running the Führer Museum for Hitler, and because of that, amassing hundreds of paintings.
Pieces of art for that it weren't his, yes.
But anyway, back to this beautiful thing, the Penitent Magdalene. Now again, emergence. Yes, we emerge from darkness. The luminosity is there, this beautiful candlelit scene. Mary Magdalene. What a woman, might I say. So little really is actually known. Maybe we could argue that what the hell do we ever know about any of these characters? You suggested as much before we started recording. I couldn't be sure. But depending on who you are, where you come from and what you believe in, she certainly was a woman who followed Christ. That's the least we could say about her. But she appears in religious painting time and time again. Some would say Christ's consort. Others might even say the mother of Christ's child. Some people could say that she was a simple well, I can't say disciple. I want to, but I shan't. Certainly someone who was very close to Christ. And if I put it like this, again, I hope I don't offend anybody, but very close, at least in legend, to the legend of Christ. And
Do you make a distinction between Jesus and Christ? I tend to use Jesus, you tend to use Christ, which has a religious connotation.
I think it's almost like having the mannerist and the realist come out, isn't it? You know, Christ is the loftier,
is the title.
Yeah. It's not an affected thing on my part. It's just, I suppose, more than the name I would use for this this thing. Anyway, this has got lots of conventions that we could even say belong to the slightly later Vanitas paintings. We have a model with a mirror, a candle, a skull.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We could talk about a sense of human vanity, the ridiculousness of it. We could think about a comment on regret and femaleness, not just because it's a female model and the title is The Penitent Magdalene, but there are lots of other, again, symbols, conventions that speak of someone who is kind of in a reverie of the past, a lament somehow.
Certainly looking backwards, it seems, figuratively and literally.
Yeah. I mean, again, for me personally, I think this is the most beautiful painting. I said already the word exquisite.
Yeah, I mean, it's very clean. I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I'm just saying it's precise.
When we look at 20th century painting, if we look at that arm and hand on the top of the skull,
yeah,
look at the way that has been painted.
Yeah, it doesn't. It's not
of its time.
Yeah, it's not correct, as it were. You know what I mean? It feels stylized in a purposeful way.
Yeah. So I mean, to me, I would look at this, if I didn't know it had been painted in 1640, I would say this was a 20th century painting. I would say this is post. I wouldn't even be tricked into thinking it was a pre-Raphaelite kind of fable. I would think it was 20th century. I would think it was a symbolist. I think it was Christian Schad.
Yeah. This could certainly be early 20th century something or other, you know.
Again, I asked the question of you, you know, does something emerge from this painting to you?
This is, you know, there are albums of music that feel like they're ahead of their time. You know, Elvis Costello's This Year's Model does not sound like it came out in 1977 or 78 or whatever it was. It sounds like it came out in 1982. I feel like in some ways this painting feels like it should not have been made in 1640.
So how does that come about, Bill? We're looking at 3 paintings.
Yeah.
In some way, as far as I can tell, each of them has a quality of otherness that is not just about their moment, their ontology or their more practical context. that there's something in them that moves beyond. It's so tricky saying this without sounding like you've gone totally mad.
You think that they're...
I think these paintings are the truest sense of holy, divine, of the spirit. Not just because they're religious paintings, which each of them is. It's not just that. It's not just about Christianity.
Sure.
But I don't know if you get the same sense or any sense of that at all.
No, I don't think about it like that.
No.
I see divinity and perfection as an abstract goal that no one will ever reach.
But I want to say something about that word abstract. These are obviously figurative paintings. That doesn't matter a lot. Again, it's about a presence or something, you know, it just so happens these are figurative paintings, but I'm not sure if it's the figurative of the painting that creates this sense, or is this thing. By the way, Georges de la Tour often painted the same scene but from slightly different angles. Again, this model and this setup, he painted from a different angle for a different painting, giving it a different title in a totally different context, which is brilliant, actually, absolutely brilliant. But this is the one for me that has that power, that profound power somehow of this thing that is the divine, or approaches the divine.
You know, I'm going to explain how I feel about this in a way that you may or may not like. Okay, when humans went to the moon in the 70s during the Apollo missions, on the way back from the last 3 missions, there were cameras on the outside of the spaceship that were taking pictures of the moon while the one guy was spinning around the moon, in orbit around the moon, in the command service module. And on the way back from the moon, when they were 125,000 miles away from the moon and 125,000 miles away from the Earth, one of the guys climbed out in his suit, climbed down a railing to get the film out of this canister. And he could look forward to one direction and see the moon. He could look behind him and he could see the Earth. And in every other direction, there was absolutely nothing until the end of time, like literally to the edge of the universe, unless he hit a star on the way. Sometimes I think about somebody who was in that situation, holding onto those bars, pulling out that thing, and then just like looking over the side of the ship into the nothingness to his right or left. That freaks me the hell out because it's terrifying. But also, to me, if there's any definition of the divine, it's that. This sort of, it is so completely unknowable because our brains have not evolved to even understand it, because it's not within our realm of experience. I'm not saying that there's God down there at the end of the thing, but that sort of, anything that has humans having to do with it, like these paintings, to me, inherently doesn't have magic because the humans had something to do with it.
But I would say don't be so distracted by the props. I would say that there are things that come about through human intervention that we could almost sully with our humanness and our intervention. Yet still there might be things that are created that are not about the human who created them or the humans that the creative thing is about or intended for. And those things, whether they're pieces of sculpture or paintings or even photographs, whatever they are, works of poetry, contained within them might be the universe, not because of the human. It is a lowly human perceiving the thing and struggling to understand it or come to terms with it.
Sure. I think the lowly human, as you put it, you're already putting judgment on the humans who are making these things. But I think that they are perhaps doing a very good job describing their experience of that feeling. And that's all that these things are.
So you're compartmentalizing these things into feeling.
Well, I am a humanist through and through. So I
thought I was a humanist until I met you.
Yeah.
And now I realize I'm not.
Yes.
Bill, what has emerged across these three paintings in this conversation for you? Is it the same as always, that Sandi's a bit woo and Bill is righteous?
What there's no righteousness at all, even though I'm giving a, yeah. I think, what ultimately emerges, which is what emerges every time you and I speak, which is a greater understanding of each other and the way we see the world.
Can we finish on a poem?
Sure.
So.
Do I have to write it right now, spontaneously?
No.
Okay.
A friend bought me a beautifully bound version of The Tower by Yeats.
Okay.
This is The Hero, the Girl, and the Fool. So this is just an excerpt, but I thought somehow, for me, there was a link to these paintings. So the girl. I raced at my own image in the glass. That's so unlike myself that when you praise it, it is as though you praised another, or even mocked me with praise of my mere opposite. And when I wake towards morn, I dread myself, for the heart cries that what deception wins, cruelty must keep. Therefore be warned, and go if you have seen that image, and not the woman. The hero. I have raged at my own strength because you have loved it. The girl. If you are no more strength than I am beauty, I had better find a convent and turn nun, and none at least has all men's reverence and needs no cruelty. The hero. I have heard one say that men have reverence for their holiness and not themselves. The girl. Say on and say that only God has loved us for ourselves. But what care I that long for a man's love? The fool by the roadside. When my days that have from cradle run to grave, from grave to cradle run instead, when thoughts that a fool has wound upon a spool are but loose thread, when cradle and spool are past, and I mere shade at last, coagulate of stuff, transparent like the wind, I think that I may find a faithful love, a faithful love. You hate poetry. I love poetry. But I think that might be very apt for some.
And I think it's a good way to end 2021.
Bill, what a pleasure it's been. Our first.
As always, Sandi.
Yeah. No, but our first complete year of speaking of seeing.
A whole year of you and me? Oh my God.
Well, I mean, it's
how do people deal with it?
But in terms of
it's
a complete year.
Yeah.
We've done it.
One solid calendar year. Congratulations to us, I say.
Congratulations to us.
You're
Thanks.
here. Thank you, Sandi.